I'm going to talk to you about 4 different acrylic techniques. Glazing, wet in wet, Sgraffito, and Scumbling. These are just 4 quick techniques that can be used with any kind of paint, but we're talking about acrylics today, so I'll just stick to acrylics. Glazing is the concept of layering your paints over each other. A lot of watercolorists use this with watercolor exclusively, but it can be done with all kinds of paint. So what I'm going to do is I have these 2 lines of darker paint already laid out. I've done one glaze stroke over the red, which was basically just me taking my brush after I did the red stripe, rinsing it just slightly so it had more water than paint on it, and then running it along the edge of the red. So I have a dark red, and then I overlaid it with a stripe of watered down red. Now I'm going to take a totally different color and put it over the red and the blue and see what happens. And what I'm doing is I'm mixing my color with a little bit of water so that it's a little more transparent than normal. And what that does is it creates a new layer of color and a new layer of depth to whatever you happen to be doing. The blue and the yellow are going to react a bit and have a greenish tone as they cross. And if this was a darker or yellow, it would make more of an orange as it crossed the red, but it's kind of a very light lemon yellow, so it's not quite doing that. It's also picking up a little bit of the paint because it wasn't quite dry. And you can do that intentionally, or you can make sure it's completely dry underneath, and that way you don't have any of that coming across in your glaze mark. The next one is called wet on wet, or wet in wet, and it is exactly as it sounds. It is putting down a wet medium, in this case water, and putting your wet paint directly into it with no drying mediums used in your paint at all. So instead of doing the whole thing wet, which is something that's completely fine to do, I'm going to draw my object first, as you can see I already did, and just paint that object in water, clear water, and stay within the lines, just to demonstrate how you can do this and how you can build up shading and depth in an object by itself. So you can't see, but I've painted the whole sphere with water. Now I'm going to take my brush and get a little bit of paint, and where the shadow, the darkest shadow of the sphere would be, let's say my light source is coming from this direction, so my darkest shadow is going to be over here on this side. And I'm just barely hitting the water and allowing it to spread. It's almost like you're staining. And this is also a technique that's used largely in watercolor or in ink paintings. But acrylics can be watered down just as much. So I know, just because I've painted a lot of spheres, that a shadow on a sphere kind of takes a sort of a half moon type shape, especially if it has a direct light source just from one angle. Now, if there was a diffused light source and there was light all up here, it would be a little bit of a different shadow, but usually a shadow on a sphere takes on this kind of nature. So there's my object with wet in wet. Like I said, wet in wet doesn't have to be limited to just an object. It can be wetting the entire surface and dropping your paint in, but for our purposes, I'm just showing you how to contain it to an object. You can add other colors to that if you wanted to add more depth. In other words, not leave it reduced to just a monochromatic image while your water is still standing on the page. And you want to use a paper or a canvas or something that's going to retain that water for a while. In other words, something not very porous, because the more porous it is, it's just going to soak in faster. So now I've added another layer, I've darkened my shadow, and I've given it even more depth, and it's seeming a little bit more like three-dimensional object and not just a flat picture. Okay. The other 2 techniques are Sgraffito and Scumbling. I've already laid down a layer of paint and let them dry earlier so that I could do this quicker. And I'm going to lay a layer of paint over this lighter color. And I'm going to use my palette knife because it's a lot quicker. So with Sgraffito, you usually want your lighter color on the bottom and your darker color on top. And I'm not even going to cover the whole thing for the demonstration, but I am going to cover a good portion of it. If you want a very smooth layer on top, then of course, use your brush, minimize markings, but I'm going quickly here, so I'm going to use my palette knife. So with Sgraffito, you're etching out your image or your shading or whatever you're doing with a tool other than your brush, and you're allowing that bottom color to show through. You can already see what it's doing a little bit there. Because that bottom layer was already dry, I can scratch away the top layer and make marks with whatever tool I'm using. It doesn't have to be a palette knife, but I can create shading and texture showing that bottom layer and letting it come to the top. So if you were going to depict an object with this technique, and let's say your object is a cone, and let's say your shadow is on this side, so the lighter side is over here, I'm going to use the edge of my palette knife and kind of wipe away a little bit of that paint, and in between I'm wiping the excess paint on a towel here so that it doesn't get built up. And instead of wiping it all away and scratching it all away, I'm allowing it to be a bit textured to give it that shadow effect, because oftentimes shadows are not solid. And I'm allowing that to be my positive and negative instead of painting it on. So you're taking it away. It's a reductive process or a subtractive process, if you want to think of it that way, instead of an additive process. You're not adding paint to it, you're taking away paint from it in order to cause the image to come out. And if you've ever used Scratchboard, this is the basic concept of Scratchboard. You're just doing it while it's wet, which is important because paint doesn't dry like the substance they put on Scratchboard, and so it wouldn't work that way. So that's Sgraffito. Scumbling is allowing a layering of colors on top of each other, but not like glazing. And you would use a totally different type of brush. So with glazing, I was using a very flat bristled brush so that I got an even spread of paint. With Scumbling, I'm going to use something that is called a hog hair brush. It's hog hair bristles and it's round, so I want to use something that's round anyway, even if it's not hog hair. But hog hair is great for Scumbling because it's rough already, and what you're going to be doing is basically smushing or scratching your brush into the surface of the paint, usually in little circular motions. So if you can see the movement of my hand, I'm kind of going like that. So obviously you'd want to color this lighter than that. I'm just going to use white because it's obviously lighter. And as I put it on, thinking about the area I want to cover with it, the concentration of paint that's the most is going to be near the middle of that area. So as I lay it on, I'm allowing it to be thick in the middle, but then I'm going to kind of extend my brush around it, and it's going to get thinner and thinner and spread out more and turn into a softer edge. As you can probably already tell, this technique is great for doing things like clouds and foam on waves if you're doing a seascape. But what I'm going to use it for is to show you guys how to build up an object. So I've already got this on here, so I'm just going to go with it in this direction. I'm going to do a cylindrical object, and I'm just doing that just to establish my line here. That's the edge of my object. Assuming, once again, that the light is coming from this direction. So my heaviest, this direction, sorry. So my heaviest shadows will be over here. and my light is where I'm painting. And as I'm going to go ahead and just give an indication of how that object works. So here's my cylinder, there's the bottom of it, there's the top of it, comes around like that, and there you have a vague idea of what that cylinder looks like in space. So with the scumbling technique, I'm filling in the shadows. And as it gets darker, I don't have to have as much pigment on my brush, and I can just let it fade out. Now, I don't have a cylinder in front of me, so be sure and have your object in front of you. And if it gets too thin in the area that you want it to be the heaviest pigment, just add more, but don't add it down here. Be sure and add it where you want that pigment to be heaviest, because it's very hard to get it lighter once you get it thick, or to get it thinner, I should say. Now notice that I'm allowing the bottom layer to show through, and that's a big part of scumbling, is allowing that bottom layer of paint to show through your top layer of paint. So you're creating a texture, but you don't necessarily want a solid layer over it. And my brush is falling apart in the middle of all this. I'm sorry, guys. That's also the thing with hog's hair brushes, is they tend to do that. Now, just like over in the wet on wet, I'm going to add a second layer of pigment, just so it's not just black. I mean, yeah, blackish blue and white. I'm going to add a red, starting at my, what would be the lightest point. And doing the same thing with that, I'm just kind of pulling it into the space and allowing it to mix with the white and be part of the shadow. And with this one, I'm going to even add a third layer. So I'm using a rather big bristled brush. You can use something smaller and it'll allow you to have more control. So notice my area of concentration for pigment gets smaller and smaller. I'm not going to bring the blue all the way up because I don't want it to take over all of the red. I want the layers to be seen as layers, but also to work together. Let's see. Here we go. So I've moved to a smaller brush so that I can refine this a little bit and get rid of my harsh outline. I'm still moving in those circular motions though, and I'm still using that smushing action, pushing my brush into it. It's not exceptionally good for your bristles. That's why I say to use the hog's hair, because they're very durable and they're meant for painting roughly. I wouldn't use your very fine camel hair or sable brushes for something like this, because you'll ruin the bristles. So use something very tough. And often if you get a paint set, you know, there's going to be a hog's hair brush in there somewhere. So that is scumbling. And scumbling is a lot more about the actual action than it is about the finished product. I'm just adding some movement so that you can kind of tell that that cylinder comes around in space and is a round object and not just a flat one. Okay, that's it.